March 5, 1953. The most feared man in the Soviet Union lies dead in his dacha, surrounded by trembling officials too terrified to enter his room for hours. But as Joseph Stalin drew his final breath, two women who had shared his life faced fates that would shock even those familiar with Soviet brutality. One had already been dead for over 2 decades, yet her story was far from over. The other had vanished into the gulag system years before Stalin's death, enduring horrors that would break most human beings. Both had loved the man who would become one of history's most ruthless dictators, and both paid devastating prices for that connection. Their stories reveal a side of Stalin rarely discussed. Not the public monster, but the private man whose personal relationships were as violent and paranoid as his political rule. What happened to these women goes beyond simple tragedy. It exposes the systematic destruction of anyone who came too close to absolute power. The fate that awaited Stalin's wives after his death would prove that even in the grave, the dictator's shadow continued to destroy lives. Before Joseph Stalin became the master of the Soviet Union, he was Joseph Jugashvili, a young revolutionary from Georgia who fell deeply in love with a woman whose tragic fate would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ekaterina Kato Svanidze was barely 20 when she married the future dictator in 1906, beginning a brief but intense relationship that would end in circumstances so devastating that they fundamentally changed Stalin's personality. Kato came from a respectable Georgian family and possessed the kind of gentle religious nature that seemed completely incompatible with her husband's growing extremism. She was devoutly Orthodox Christian, spoke softly, and maintained traditional feminine virtues that contrasted sharply with the revolutionary circles in which Stalin moved. Their courtship was surprisingly conventional for a man who would later show such contempt for traditional institutions. The young couple settled in Tiflis, where Stalin continued his revolutionary activities, while Kato attempted to create a normal domestic life. She struggled with her husband's frequent absences, his dangerous political work, and the constant threat of arrest that hung over their household. The strain of living with a man who was becoming increasingly consumed by revolutionary violence began to take its toll on her health and spirit. Kato's pregnancy in 1907 brought brief happiness to their troubled marriage. Stalin showed unexpected tenderness toward his expectant wife, and for a few months it seemed possible that domestic life might soften his harsh nature. The birth of their son Yakov appeared to fulfill this hope, as Stalin demonstrated genuine affection for the child and seemed to find peace in his role as a father. But the respite was tragically brief. In late 1907, Kato began suffering from what appeared to be typhus, though some historians suggest other illnesses may have been responsible for her rapid decline. The primitive medical care available in early 20th century Georgia was inadequate to address her condition, and Stalin watched helplessly as his young wife weakened day by day. Kato's death in December 1907 had a profound and lasting impact on Stalin's psychological development. According to witnesses, he was devastated by her loss and spent hours staring at her body, refusing to accept that she was gone. His grief was so intense that friends worried about his mental stability, while his behavior became increasingly erratic and violent in the months following her funeral. The funeral itself became a traumatic event that would echo through Stalin's life and the lives of Kato's surviving relatives. As her coffin was lowered into the ground, Stalin reportedly declared that with her death, his last warm feelings for humanity died as well. Whether this statement was literally true or not, his subsequent behavior suggested that Kato's death marked a turning point toward the cold brutality that would characterize his later rule. Kato's family, particularly her brothers, maintained close relationships with Stalin in the years following her death. They helped raise young Yakov and provided emotional support during Stalin's frequent imprisonments and exiles. These connections would prove to be both a blessing and a curse as Stalin rose to power, creating bonds that he would eventually view with suspicion and paranoia. The memory of Kato became idealized in Stalin's mind, transforming her into a symbol of lost innocence and happiness that could never be recovered. He kept her photograph on his desk throughout his life, and would sometimes speak of her in moments of rare vulnerability. But this idealization also created impossible standards for any other woman who entered his life, contributing to the dysfunction of his later relationships. As Stalin consolidated power in the Soviet Union, Kato's relatives found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Their connection to the leader initially provided privileges and protection, but Stalin's growing paranoia eventually made any personal relationship with him dangerous. The same bonds that had once offered security became potential death sentences as the dictator turned against anyone who might have influence over him. The tragic irony of Kato's story was that her death, which had caused Stalin such profound grief, would eventually be overshadowed by the systematic destruction he would inflict on her surviving family members. The woman whose loss had supposedly killed his capacity for human warmth would become the reason for inflicting even more suffering on those who had loved her. But the full scope of Stalin's vengeance against Kato's memory would only become clear after his own death, when the surviving members of her family faced retribution that extended far beyond the grave. The Svanidze family's connection to Stalin through his first wife Kato initially seemed like a blessing that would protect them from the purges that consumed millions of Soviet citizens. Alexander and Alyosha Svanidze, Kato's brothers, became trusted members of Stalin's inner circle during the 1920s and early 1930s, serving in important positions and enjoying the privileges that came with proximity to power. Alexander Svanidze was particularly close to Stalin, serving as a financial expert and trusted advisor on economic matters. He had helped care for Stalin's son Yakov after Kato's death and maintained the kind of personal relationship with the leader that few others could claim. His position seemed secure, and he used his influence to help other family members and friends navigate the dangerous waters of Soviet politics. Alyosha Svanidze worked in the foreign ministry and accompanied Stalin on various official functions. He was one of the few people who could speak to Stalin with relative informality, sharing memories of Kato and discussing family matters in ways that others would never dare attempt. This intimacy, however, would eventually become a source of vulnerability rather than strength. The Svanidze family's privileged position began to erode in the mid-1930s as Stalin's paranoia reached new heights. The dictator became increasingly suspicious of anyone who had known him before his rise to power, viewing their familiarity as potential threats to his authority. The very intimacy that had once made the Svanidzes valuable became evidence of their dangerous influence over him. Maria Svanidze, Alexander's wife and an opera singer, made the fatal mistake of keeping a diary that recorded her observations of Stalin's behavior and personality. Her detailed notes about family gatherings, Stalin's moods, and his relationships with other family members were discovered during a routine search of their apartment. The diary's intimate portrait of the dictator as a human being, rather than a godlike figure, was seen as evidence of treasonous familiarity. The arrests began in 1937. During the height of the Great Terror. Alexander Svanidze was taken first, accused of participating in a conspiracy against Stalin, despite his years of loyal service. The charges were fabricated and the evidence non-existent, but the NKVD had quotas to fill and lists of names to process. His connection to Stalin, once a source of protection, now made him a high-value target for interrogators seeking to demonstrate their zeal. Maria Svanidze was arrested shortly after her husband, charged with espionage and counter-revolutionary activities, based largely on the contents of her diary. The opera singer who had entertained Stalin's guests and sung at family celebrations found herself in Lubyanka prison, subjected to interrogations designed to extract confessions of crimes she had never committed. Alyosha Svanidze's arrest completed the destruction of Kato's immediate family. Despite his years of service in the foreign ministry and his personal loyalty to Stalin, he was accused of being a foreign agent who had used his family connections to infiltrate the highest levels of Soviet government. The absurdity of the charges was irrelevant in a system where guilt was predetermined, and evidence was manufactured to fit predetermined conclusions. The interrogations of the Svanidze family members were particularly brutal because of their personal connection to Stalin. NKVD officers sought to extract information about the dictator's private life, his family relationships, and his personal habits that could potentially be used against him. The prisoners' intimate knowledge of Stalin made them valuable sources of intelligence, even as it sealed their doom. Alexander Svanidze endured months of torture and psychological pressure before finally signing a confession, admitting to crimes he had never committed. The document, extracted through techniques that broke stronger men than him, became the basis for his death sentence. His execution in 1941 eliminated one of the last people who could speak with authority about Stalin's early life and first marriage. Maria Svanidze faced a different kind of torture during her imprisonment. As a woman and an artist, she was subjected to specific forms of abuse designed to break her spirit and extract information about Stalin's domestic life. Her interrogators were particularly interested in her observations of Stalin's relationships with women and his treatment of family members, information that could potentially be used for blackmail or manipulation. The fate of Alyosha Svanidze was kept secret for months, as Stalin maintained the pretense that he was unaware of his brother-in-law's arrest. When the execution finally took place in 1941, it was carried out quietly without the fanfare that accompanied other high-profile cases. The man who had shared Stalin's grief over Kato's death died in a basement cell, forgotten by the system he had served faithfully. The destruction of the Svanidzes family represented more than just another example of Stalin's paranoia and brutality. It demonstrated his willingness to eliminate even the most intimate connections to his past. Destroying the last links to the young man he had been before, power transformed him into a monster. Kato's family paid the ultimate price for their knowledge of Stalin's humanity. But the tragedy of the Svanidzes was only one part of a larger pattern of destruction that would continue even after Stalin's death, as the secrets buried with their executions would surface to haunt their surviving relatives. Nadezhda Alliluyeva entered Stalin's life in 1918, when she was just 17 years old, and he was a 39-year-old revolutionary leader with a young son from his first marriage. Their relationship began against the backdrop of civil war and political upheaval, factors that would continue to strain their marriage throughout its turbulent 14-year duration. Nadia came from a Bolshevik family with strong revolutionary credentials. Her father, Sergei Alliluyev, had been an early supporter of Lenin and had provided safe houses for revolutionary activities. This political background made her an acceptable partner for Stalin, who was becoming increasingly prominent in the Bolshevik hierarchy. Their marriage in 1919 united two committed revolutionary families and strengthened Stalin's position within the party. The early years of their marriage were marked by the chaos of civil war and Stalin's frequent absences on party business. Nadia struggled to maintain a household while her husband traveled throughout the Soviet Union, implementing policies that often resulted in mass violence and starvation. She began to witness firsthand the gap between communist ideals and the brutal reality of Stalin's methods. As Stalin consolidated power throughout the 1920s, Nadia found herself increasingly isolated and disturbed by her husband's transformation from revolutionary idealist to paranoid dictator. She observed his growing cruelty toward subordinates, his casual disregard for human suffering, and his increasing detachment from the consequences of his policies. The man she had married was disappearing, replaced by someone she struggled to recognize. Nadia's own political consciousness continued to develop during this period, and she began to express doubts about the direction of Soviet policy. She was particularly disturbed by the forced collectivization of agriculture and the famine that resulted from these policies. Her concerns about peasant suffering put her at odds with her husband, who viewed such sentiments as weakness and potential disloyalty. The couple had 2 children together, Vasily in 1921 and Svetlana in 1926, but even parenthood could not bridge the growing gap between them. Stalin showed little interest in domestic life and treated his family with the same authoritarian approach he used in politics. He expected absolute obedience and became enraged when Nadia expressed independent thoughts or challenged his decisions. Nadia's mental health began to deteriorate as the pressures of her marriage and her horror at Soviet policies combined to create an unbearable psychological burden. She suffered from severe headaches, depression, and anxiety that were exacerbated by her isolation and the impossibility of seeking help or support. In Stalin's Soviet Union, admitting psychological problems was seen as weakness that could have fatal consequences. The tension between the couple reached crisis levels by 1932, as the Ukrainian famine claimed millions of lives and Stalin's paranoia reached new heights. Nadia could no longer remain silent about the suffering she witnessed, while Stalin became increasingly intolerant of any criticism, even from his wife. Their arguments became more frequent and more bitter, often ending with Stalin storming out or Nadia retreating in tears. The final confrontation came on November 8, 1932, during a dinner party at the Kremlin, celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Witnesses reported that Stalin was particularly cruel to Nadia that evening, publicly humiliating her and dismissing her concerns about Soviet policies. The evening ended with a heated argument that continued after the guests had departed. What happened next remains one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Stalin era. On the morning of November 9th, Nadia was found dead in her bedroom with a pistol beside her body. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the circumstances strongly suggested that she had taken her own life in despair over her marriage and the state of the Soviet Union. Stalin's reaction to his wife's death was complex and contradictory. He appeared genuinely grief-stricken and reportedly blamed himself for her fate. Yet he also immediately began constructing a narrative that would protect his political position. The true circumstances of Nadia's death were classified as a state secret, and anyone with knowledge of the events was warned to remain silent. The funeral was a carefully orchestrated affair that presented Nadia as a devoted communist who had died tragically young while serving the revolution. Stalin played the role of grieving widower, while secretly ordering investigations into whether his wife's death was somehow connected to opposition groups or foreign enemies. His paranoia extended even to his wife's grave. The impact of Nadia's death on Stalin's subsequent behavior was profound and lasting. Those close to him noted that he became even more suspicious and cruel after losing his second wife, as if her death had confirmed his belief that everyone close to him was a potential enemy. The tragedy marked another step in his transformation from revolutionary leader to isolated tyrant. But Nadia's death was not the end of her story or her family's suffering. The Alliluyevs family would discover that their connection to Stalin's deceased wife made them permanent targets for his suspicion and eventual vengeance, leading to a campaign of destruction that would continue for decades. The Alliluyevs family's connection to Stalin through Nadia initially provided them with significant privileges and protection within the Soviet system. Sergei Alliluyev, Nadia's father, held important positions in the government, while other family members enjoyed access to special stores, better housing, and educational opportunities denied to ordinary citizens. However, these advantages came with the constant pressure of living under Stalin's scrutiny and the ever-present danger of falling from favor. After Nadia's death in 1932, Stalin's relationship with her family became increasingly strained and paranoid. He suspected that they might blame him for her fate or possess dangerous knowledge about the circumstances of her death. The very intimacy that had once made them valuable allies now made them potential threats who needed to be monitored and controlled. Pavel Alliluyev, Nadia's brother, served as a military commissar and maintained a close relationship with Stalin even after his sister's death. He was one of the few people who dared to speak to Stalin about Nadia's memory, and occasionally reminded him of her concerns about Soviet policies. This familiarity, however, gradually became a source of irritation rather than comfort for the increasingly isolated dictator. Anna Alliluyeva, Nadia's sister, worked as a military doctor and was married to Stanislav Redens, a high-ranking NKVD official. Their positions seemed secure given Redens's role in the secret police apparatus. But this security was illusory in a system where today's executioner could become tomorrow's victim. Anna witnessed the gradual destruction of other families connected to Stalin and began to fear for her own relatives. The first major blow to the Alliluyev family came in 1938 when Stanislav Redens was arrested on charges of espionage and counter-revolutionary activities. Despite his years of faithful service to Stalin and his role in implementing some of the regime's most brutal policies, Redens found himself accused of plotting against the leader he had served so loyally. His arrest sent shockwaves through the family and demonstrated that no connection to Stalin could guarantee survival. Redens' interrogation was particularly brutal because of his intimate knowledge of NKVD operations and his family's connection to Stalin. His interrogators sought information about Stalin's private life, his relationship with Nadia, and the circumstances surrounding her death. The former secret police official found himself subjected to the same techniques he had once used against others, as the system he had helped create turned against him. The execution of Stanislav Redens in 1940 was kept secret from his family for months. Anna Alliluyeva was told that her husband was serving a prison sentence in a remote camp, while their children were informed that their father was working on important government business. The deception continued for years, with Anna receiving forged letters supposedly written by her imprisoned husband. Pavel Alliluyev's arrest followed shortly after his brother-in-law's execution. Despite his military service and political loyalty, he was charged with participating in a conspiracy against Stalin and accused of maintaining suspicious contacts with foreign elements. The evidence against him was fabricated, but in Stalin's Soviet Union, guilt was predetermined, and confessions were extracted through torture rather than investigation. The destruction of Pavel Alliluyev was particularly tragic because he had genuinely believed in communist ideology and had served the Soviet cause with dedication. His interrogators forced him to confess to crimes he had never committed, using psychological torture and threats against his family to break his resistance. His execution in 1940 eliminated another person who had known Stalin before his rise to absolute power. Anna Alliluyeva found herself in an impossible position as the widow of an executed enemy of the people and the sister of another traitor. She was expelled from her job as a military doctor and faced constant surveillance by the secret police. Her children were stigmatized as the offspring of enemies and faced discrimination in education and employment opportunities. The surviving members of the Alliluyev family lived in constant fear of arrest and deportation. They were forbidden from speaking about their executed relatives and were required to denounce them publicly as traitors to the Soviet cause. The psychological pressure of maintaining these lies while grieving for their loved ones took a devastating toll on their mental and physical health. Sergei Alliluyev, Nadia's father, managed to survive the purges, but only by completely severing all connections to his executed sons-in-law and avoiding any discussion of his daughter's death. The old revolutionary who had once welcomed Stalin into his home became a broken man who lived in terror of saying or doing anything that might provoke the dictator's wrath. The campaign against the Alliluyev family represented more than just another example of Stalin's paranoia. It demonstrated his determination to eliminate anyone who might possess compromising information about his personal life or who could serve as a reminder of his human relationships. The family that had given him his second wife paid a terrible price for that connection. But even Stalin's death in 1953 would not end the persecution of those connected to his personal life. The secrets buried with the executed family members would continue to haunt their survivors for decades to come. Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter by his second wife Nadia, carried the heaviest burden of all the dictator's surviving relatives. Born in 1926, she grew up believing the official version of her mother's death until devastating revelations in adulthood forced her to confront the terrible truth about her family's history and her father's role in destroying everyone who had loved him. During her childhood, Svetlana was told that her mother had died of a sudden illness, a version of events that Stalin had carefully constructed to protect both his political position and his daughter's innocence. She grew up with idealized memories of Nadia, supplemented by carefully selected photographs and stories from relatives who had been instructed never to discuss the true circumstances of her mother's death. The first cracks in this protective narrative appeared when Svetlana was in her teens and began asking more probing questions about her mother's death. Family members gave evasive answers or quickly changed the subject, creating an atmosphere of secrecy that made her increasingly suspicious. Her father's reaction to questions about Nadia was particularly telling. He would become angry or withdrawn whenever her name was mentioned. The truth about Nadia's death was finally revealed to Svetlana in 1943 when she was 17 years old. Anna Alliluyeva, her aunt, could no longer bear the deception and told her niece that Nadia had taken her own life after a bitter confrontation with Stalin. The revelation shattered Svetlana's understanding of her family history and forced her to confront the possibility that her father was responsible for her mother's death. Learning about her mother's tragic end was devastating enough, but Svetlana soon discovered that the destruction had extended far beyond Nadia herself. She gradually learned about the arrests and executions of her aunts, uncles, and cousins, people who had loved her mother and been destroyed for their connection to the Stalin family. The scope of the tragedy overwhelmed her and fundamentally changed her relationship with her father. The knowledge that her father had systematically eliminated her mother's family created an unbearable psychological burden for Svetlana. She found herself caught between her love for the man who had raised her and her horror at his actions against her relatives. The comfortable world of her childhood was replaced by the terrible realization that she was the daughter of a monster. Svetlana's relationship with her father became increasingly strained as she struggled to reconcile her personal knowledge of him with his public persona and his private cruelty. She began to understand that the affection he showed her was conditional and could be withdrawn if she ever challenged him or became inconvenient. The fear that haunted other Soviet citizens extended even to his own daughter. The weight of carrying these family secrets while maintaining the facade of a loyal daughter took a severe toll on Svetlana's mental health. She suffered from depression and anxiety, exacerbated by her isolation and the impossibility of discussing her true feelings with anyone. In Stalin's Soviet Union, expressing doubts about the leader's character was dangerous, even for his own daughter. Svetlana's marriages and relationships were complicated by her father's interference and her own psychological struggles. Stalin disapproved of her romantic choices and used his power to separate her from men he deemed unsuitable, including her first husband, whom he had arrested shortly after their wedding. Her personal life became another arena for her father's control and manipulation. The burden of her knowledge became even heavier after Stalin's death in 1953, when Svetlana gained access to additional information about her family's fate. She learned details about the torture and execution of her relatives that had been hidden from her during her father's lifetime. The full scope of the destruction inflicted on her mother's family became clear only after the man responsible was gone. Svetlana's eventual decision to defect to the United States in 1967 was motivated partly by her desire to escape the suffocating weight of her family history and to tell the truth about what had happened to her mother and relatives. Her memoir, Only 1 Year, provided the first detailed account of Stalin's private life and the destruction of his family members. The revelations in Svetlana's memoir shocked the world and provided crucial insights into Stalin's personality and methods. Her first-hand accounts of family conversations, her father's behavior, and the fate of their relatives offered unprecedented glimpses into the private life of one of history's most secretive dictators. The daughter's testimony became a crucial historical document. But even after fleeing to the West and publishing her story, Svetlana could never fully escape the burden of being Stalin's daughter. She spent the rest of her life struggling with the legacy of her family name and the knowledge of what her father had done to those who had loved him. The tragedy that began with her mother's death continued to shape her life decades later. The story of Svetlana's burden illustrates how Stalin's destruction of his wives extended across generations, creating trauma that affected even those who had not directly experienced his violence. The sins of the father were visited upon the daughter in ways that would haunt her until her death in 2011. The few surviving members of both the Svanidze and Alliluyeva families who lived through Stalin's purges faced a peculiar form of continuing persecution even after the dictator's death. They possessed intimate knowledge of Stalin's private life and the circumstances surrounding his wives' fates, making them dangerous witnesses to history who had to be carefully managed by Soviet authorities. Those who had escaped execution or imprisonment discovered that their survival came with strict conditions. They were forbidden from discussing their experiences or sharing their knowledge of Stalin's family life with anyone, including historians or journalists. The state secrets that had protected Stalin during his lifetime continued to protect his legacy after his death, enforced through surveillance and threats against the survivors. Kira Alliluyeva, Pavel's daughter, spent years in Soviet labor camps as the child of an enemy of the people. When she was finally released after Stalin's death, she found herself in a strange limbo where she was neither fully rehabilitated nor completely condemned. She was allowed to live quietly in Moscow, but was required to report regularly to authorities and was forbidden from speaking about her father or her famous uncle. The psychological impact of this enforced silence was devastating for the survivors. They had witnessed or experienced terrible tragedies, but were unable to process their grief publicly or seek support from others who might understand their experiences. The isolation was compounded by the knowledge that their suffering was deliberately hidden from history. Some survivors attempted to preserve their memories by writing secret diaries or letters that they hoped might someday be discovered and published. These documents, hidden in walls or buried in gardens, represented desperate attempts to ensure that the truth about Stalin's family would not die with them. The act of writing became a form of resistance against the state's campaign to control their narrative. The Soviet authorities' management of Stalin's family survivors was part of a broader effort to control his historical legacy. The regime needed to maintain the fiction that Stalin had been a devoted family man, while suppressing evidence of his cruelty toward his own relatives. The survivors represented a potential threat to this carefully constructed image. Medical records, death certificates, and other documents related to the deaths of Stalin's wives and in-laws were classified at the highest levels of secrecy. Doctors who had treated family members were transferred to remote locations or faced other forms of pressure to ensure their silence. The conspiracy of silence extended throughout the Soviet medical and administrative apparatus. Even after the partial de-Stalinization that occurred under Nikita Khrushchev, information about Stalin's family remained strictly classified. While other aspects of Stalin's crimes were eventually acknowledged and discussed, his treatment of his own family was considered too sensitive to reveal. The personal nature of these crimes somehow made them more dangerous to discuss than his political atrocities. The few historians who attempted to research Stalin's family life faced significant obstacles and threats. Archives remained closed, witnesses refused to speak, and official sources continued to repeat the fabricated versions of events that had been created during Stalin's lifetime. The truth about his wives remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in Soviet history. International interest in Stalin's family life grew during the Cold War, but Soviet authorities successfully prevented most outside researchers from gaining access to relevant information. The few details that leaked out were often dismissed as propaganda or unreliable gossip, allowing the official narrative to persist largely unchallenged. The survivors who managed to emigrate to the West faced different challenges but similar pressures to remain silent. They discovered that their stories were often met with skepticism or disbelief, as Western audiences struggled to comprehend the full extent of Stalin's cruelty toward his own family. Some chose to remain silent rather than face questions about their credibility. The burden of carrying these secrets affected the survivors' relationships with their own children and grandchildren. Many chose not to share their family history, hoping to protect their descendants from the stigma and danger associated with their connection to Stalin. This decision created gaps in family knowledge that would persist for generations. The psychological toll of enforced silence was particularly severe for those who had loved Stalin's wives and witnessed their suffering. They carried guilt about their inability to protect their relatives, anger about the injustices they had witnessed, and grief that they could never fully express. The combination of these emotions, suppressed for decades, created lasting psychological damage. Some survivors developed elaborate coping mechanisms to deal with their imposed silence. They created coded ways of discussing their experiences with trusted family members, used euphemisms and indirect references to avoid direct violations of their restrictions, and found subtle ways to honor the memory of their dead relatives without attracting official attention. But the truth about Stalin's wives would eventually surface. Despite decades of official suppression and survivor silence, the end of the Soviet Union would finally allow these long-buried secrets to emerge into the light. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 allowed a long-overdue investigation into Stalin's treatment of his wives and their families. With previously sealed archives opened and witnesses finally able to speak freely, a disturbing portrait of personal cruelty emerged, one that paralleled Stalin's political atrocities. Documents revealed Stalin's obsessive surveillance of his own relatives, fabricated charges, and the torture of in-laws to extract personal information. NKVD interrogations focused on Stalin's domestic life, seeking evidence of instability that could be used against him. Medical records confirmed that Nadezhda Alliluyeva, Stalin's second wife, had died by suicide, contradicting decades of state cover-ups. Newly uncovered letters and diaries painted a grim picture of fear, isolation, and fading hope within Stalin's inner circle. By the 1990s, Stalin's executed in-laws, including Alexander Svanidze and Pavel Alliluyev, were officially rehabilitated, though these symbolic gestures could not undo the suffering. Surviving relatives began to speak publicly, write memoirs, or quietly reclaim their stories after years of enforced silence. Stalin's paranoia not only destroyed his own family, but also triggered wider purges targeting anyone connected to them. Access to archives enabled historians to finally trace the personal dimension of Stalinist repression and revise his psychological profile, revealing a man whose private cruelty mirrored his public tyranny. Memorials and public commemorations gave grieving families long-denied closure. Stalin's treatment of his wives became part of a broader re-examination of totalitarianism's effects on personal life, exposing how regimes manipulate not only politics, but also human relationships. Post-Soviet educational programs began teaching about these hidden victims, restoring Stalin's wives and their families to their rightful place in history. Their fate underscored how totalitarian control extends beyond ideology into the most intimate parts of life. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.